Welcome to the Innovative Pedagogy Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Garcia, and we have a great program for you today. Today we have a very special guest, Dr. Laura Lemos. She's currently a vice principal, and she has a history of working with urban schools in Los Angeles and San Diego. She's also a graduate from the University of Southern California, and I also may add this, that she and I had the personal and professional honor of teaching sixth grade together in the recent past. So welcome to the show, Dr. Lemos.
Thank you for having me today.
Definitely. I'm so honored to have you. I know I had mentioned you before on the first episode of having you as one of the experts here. So there's a lot of topics I want to talk to you about, but one of the ones I really wanted to dive into was your expertise and experience of addressing something you really hold dear to your heart, and that is working with the special needs population. So before anything else, let's go ahead and tackle that part. So how has this specific population won your heart?
So there's two kind of big ways that this population has won my heart. The first is with all of the kids that I have worked with over the last 15 years in education, my kiddos who have had any type of special needs or have needed any additional work have, by and large, been the grittiest, and the kids who have just persevered through so many other obstacles, never made excuses for themselves, and kind of were the ones that I saw the most significant gains in 1 year. And so that was not only amazing to see their growth, but was also very personally rewarding because I could see how far they've come every year. And then secondly, to be very candid, my son has special needs, and so his experience with his teachers has really led me to walk the walk and believe that I cannot expect another teacher to be the teacher that I'm not. I cannot expect another teacher to be the type of teacher I want for my son when I am not that type of teacher with everybody else's kids. And so I hold myself to a very very high expectations in terms of my work with all of my students, but particularly in everyday working to meet the needs of my special needs kids in my class.
Definitely. And I'm just going to add that when we did work together in the classroom, when it came to planning for our students, I really enjoyed and always felt convicted. The very fact is, as we were planning, not only did we look after our general ed students, our English language learners, but it was always what do we have to do to modify to give all students access and make it very equitable to every learning experience in the classroom. So that's something that I personally can add of experiencing and working together with you. So regarding some of that, what are some of the best practices you've seen in the field of education when it comes to working with this population of students?
I think it's one of those very understated practices is really just getting to know the kids. One of the most powerful things that I've done in the classroom is being consistent with working one-on-one with students, working in small groups with students, in order to really identify where the needs were, where the kids were having trouble, where there was confusions, because there's one thing to be able to be in a whole group and kind of monitor where all the kids are at, and there's another thing to watch a kid as they're trying to go through a process and then being able to see those moments of hesitation, like, oh, so you're not getting to the very end, but maybe it's just this first step that you're still a little confused on. And so being able to really pinpoint what the child's needs are, and in that way being able to help them through the process is something that I think is understated and we don't do often enough. One of the strategies that I've always used in my classrooms from first grade through sixth grade all the way to the times where I've had to cover in eighth grade classes, I always did small group instruction. And with kids with special needs or any of my kids who just needed some more support, these were the kids that I saw each and every day. And it became such a staple in my classroom that all the kids knew that I was there to help them, because I wasn't just helping my kids who were struggling or who needed more help. I was helping my gifted kids. I was helping my kids who were already proficient. I was helping my bubble kids who were almost there. I was helping every single group. And so they knew that I was a cheerleader for all of them. So they never felt as though they were being singled out,
Right.
or that I was just being annoying because I wanted them to come back to my group. No, they knew everybody was going to have an opportunity to come to my group. Their group just so happened to come more often.
Right.
And that made it so really everybody was fighting to be in a small group, which is very different from what you see today in a classroom, where sometimes kids are like, well, no, only the kids who are struggling go and get help from the teacher. Nobody else does. And so when a teacher is inconsistent with the small group instruction, it can become a practice that kids feel points them out as being the struggling kid, versus having small group integrated into every content area throughout the day. Everybody at some point throughout the day was going to be in a small group with me. So
Right.
it didn't matter if they were the highest kid or the kid that was struggling the most. They were going to be in a small group, and that allowed kids to feel more comfortable, allowed me to see where each and every child was and to continue helping them.
That's pretty remarkable, especially because, I mean, that opens up, of course, that whole equitable access. And then at the same time, you see where students don't feel that label on them, because everybody has that opportunity to be in a small group. So, and that's always been one of the things that I've enjoyed. And actually, I did not do it as much up until we actually started teaching at the same school site. So for a good 2.5 years of my career, or towards the latter part of being in the general classroom, I would say that those were my favorite times of really getting to know the students and being able to see that. So definitely, that's really, really awesome. And that also leads me to kind of talk about how you've collaborated with other teachers as far as the special ed teachers that have come into your classroom. I do know this, is you were a big advocate, and it was something that we did together, as far as we all made a push for it, but of having inclusion. And
Yes.
having special ed teachers come into that. So how does that collaboration, how has that looked like when you have a special ed teacher come into the general ed classroom?
So one of my one of the things that I felt was the most important was to have good collaboration and good conversations. It was always in starting where the kids were, like figuring out where the kids were, and having that in mind, but also having in mind where I wanted them to be. So as a teacher, I was very cognizant that even though my student had an IEP, I was still required to teach and give access to grade level standards. So in working with the special ed department, collaborated to see what are the standards, where are my kids, and what is the bridge that we need to ensure that we're showing the kids in order for the kids to be able to access the standards. Now, some of the standards were very difficult, especially when you got into sixth grade math.
Right.
We can all agree that sixth grade math is not always as easy as we would like it to be.
Right.
But I think that collaboration allowed us to modify the work in such a way that students were still given access to the grade level standards, but maybe they were working on a simpler way of getting to those standards. I also collaborated a lot because I believe that in math, one of the reasons why some of our kiddos are falling behind is because they're not given enough access to conceptual, like to really understanding it and getting hands-on with it. And so one of the things that I like to do with when we were collaborating was really to walk through why things work the way they do, and to really emphasize that when the RSP teacher was working with the kids, that they would always try to revert back to this why. Why does this work this way? Not simply going to the algorithm, because the reality is that I knew that some of my kids had difficulty with processing, had difficulty with being able to be very quick at things. So when I gave them a timed multiplication, I already knew that they weren't going to do well, simply because they would process things a little bit slower. Not because they weren't capable, but because it was just going to take them a little bit longer. And so kind of trying to keep that in mind, we tried to make sure that everything that we were giving to them was with ample time where they were able to really understand the why of what the problem was, which is tricky when you get into sixth grade math. When you're talking about fractions and divisions of fractions, it's not always an easy task, but it's definitely, once the kids understand why things work, then they're better equipped to look at different types of problems.
That's really remarkable. And I remember even just there would be times where we had to put the pacing guide aside, even though we had a pacing guide, because it was authentic for our students to be like, all right, this is where we're at, and this is how much time we should probably be giving them. Or there were certain concepts they were barely starting to have the light turn on, and we were like, all right, we got to stick with it and run with it and make it grow into that expansion. So that's another topic for maybe another discussion, but definitely the whole idea of giving students that access and that time to work at something. And anything else? Or
to work at something. I just remember, it was very telling. The year that we worked together, I had a student who was very, very strong in English language arts, but really struggled in math. And I remember she would come to me and she was frustrated, and and that was part of kind of the additional support that she needed, is that she would easily become frustrated with certain tasks. But when I asked her, she's like, it's because I've never done this before. I've never actually seen how you multiply decimals. This was the first time I've ever done it, because what was happening previously, she wasn't included always in direct math instruction by the general ed teacher. So she had some gaps in her understandings and her strategies. So when she was in an inclusion classroom for sixth grades, there was clearly some things that she needed additional support on, not because she wasn't capable, but simply because she had never been given access to it. And so that's one of the things that I have always kept at the forefront of my mind, and one of the things that I advocate for anybody who has a child who receives RSP services is, RSP in an ideal world should be an additive program, not an instead of. After the general ed instruction, then they're receiving additional support in order to support them in that general ed instruction, versus I'm going to give you a lesson instead of the general ed instruction, because that's when some kids will begin to develop gaps, because they didn't actually have access, were never given direct instruction on certain things that they're seeing, particularly in math. And then we ding them because come the assessment, they don't know what to do, they're failing. Oh, well, see, they don't know, they can't do it. Well, if they were never taught it, then is it that they can't do it, or they just simply didn't have access to it? Right.
And it's one of those things where you see it's like, and it's like, that's why we call it standards. And I was noticing that when we were doing something like that, we held kids accountable to those standards. And it's kind of like what we've talked about even with John Hattie, as far as keeping that high level of expectation there, but still giving them that access. And by being able to do that, it's remarkable to see the way a child's brain works, because sometimes it'll just click.
Exactly.
It'll just click. And it's like those gaps that you're mentioning, it's like, they're just filled up because oh, wait, now I get it. It's kind of like exactly what your student told you. Like, no one's ever taught me, and it finally makes sense. So, yeah, that's pretty remarkable as far as keeping those high level. And again, that's even a topic for another discussion, but just being able to have those high standards for your students, regardless of what the quote unquote IEP is telling us.
Yes.
It's one of those things like, this is the standard for your grade, and this is our expectations, and we're going to power through together in order to get you there. So that's pretty remarkable. And speaking of powering through, it kind of leads us to this next part of talking about how do you motivate students to persevere with challenging assignments and tasks?
I think one of the things that I've done as a teacher, and now is a little bit more tricky as an admin, but as a teacher, to get my students to persevere, I always focused on growth. So the conversation in my classroom was always about, where did you start and where are you ending? And what we're looking at is how much growth did we see in between. And so this conversation was very motivating to the kids, especially the kids who recognized that no matter how much growth they needed to make in a year, that it was virtually impossible for them to get to this finish line, right? They were simply not going to meet proficiency because they were so far behind. So always focusing on proficiency became a mute conversation in the classroom, because there was simply no like mathematical way that they were going to grow 700 points in their Lexile, or they were going to improve this much in terms of their math. However, when I presented it to them as, you are at, say, 200 in Lexile, which is beginning of first grade.
Right.
What I want you to get to is about 500 in Lexile. If you get to 500, that means the gap for next year is that much smaller and that much more reasonable for you to be able to tackle.
Right.
So one of the ways that I think one of the reasons why students were so willing to persevere and to be motivated is that they knew that their goals were something that they could attain within the year. Mm-hmm. And that the celebration that I gave a kid who went from 200 Lexile to 500 Lexile was the same celebration I gave for the kid that went from 1,000 Lexile to 1,300 Lexile. Like, the celebration was going to be there, the pride was going to be there, the hard work was going to be there. And I think my excitement helped them to feel excited and feel motivated.
Right.
And then working in small groups, there was a level of trust that they knew when something became difficult that they knew that I was never going to give them something that was so difficult that I didn't think that they could do.
Right.
And then they also knew that no matter how difficult it was, a thing that I was giving them, that I already had supports in mind for how to help them if they started to feel frustrated. And so I was their constant cheerleaders, and sometimes I was annoying, and sometimes they didn't like it. But I think it was that constant pushing and constant checking in and constant, how can I help? And that, all right, you're going to do this on your own because we've already done enough of them and you can handle this. The building of their self-efficacy and their self-esteem really allowed them to feel much more independent, and then ultimately become independent because they no longer needed me, and they felt confident in being able to attack the problem, and me rooting for them every step of the way, even when they no longer needed me. So I think part of motivating kids to persevere is them knowing that they have a cheerleader and they have somebody in their corner who, no matter if they're winning or they're not quite doing it correctly, we're still going to root for them, and we're still always there to help them.
Which is a great segue to even the last question we're going to focus on. And as far as giving them that cheerleading and that encouragement that that our students pretty much consistently need, is how about encouraging parental involvement in student learning? I definitely address it as far as the students with special needs population, but even in general, I know you've worked with different populations in urban schools and areas where you have students that unfortunately may not have the parents to go to or the support to go to. So what is it that you normally can do to bring that about for their lives?
Well, I think with parent involvement, it's always the ideal. You always want to have parents who are have the time to help, are coming home and they're rested so they can dedicate time to their students' homework. But as a teacher, I knew that wasn't always a reality. And so while I would encourage it, I also knew that I couldn't use the lack of parent involvement as an excuse to not push the kids forward. But in terms of parent involvement, one of the things that I did a lot in my classroom is having constant communication with parents, so parents who were able to work with their kids, for parents who were able to work with their kids, for parents who had the time to work for their kids, they could really take advantage of any time that they had and focus on specific skills that I needed them to work on. And so I think it was that greater communication on, hey, we're working on this math problem today, and I realize that he or she is having trouble with X. this is where they need help, and then from there they can get everything else. So just being very specific in the feedback that I was giving parents, and specific with feedback that I was giving kids, so that they could really verbalize at home what it was that they needed help with, and creating materials and sharing materials with parents in order for them to be able to feel like they had something and understood what it was that they needed to be doing and what the expectation was. And actually something that I know that you did a lot in your classroom was making videos.
Yeah,
and I think that was huge. Once we started making videos and were consistent with them, that really helped not only the kids, but the parents to like, oh, that's what the teacher is asking me for.
Right. Yeah, I'm never going to forget those opportunities of making like flipped classroom type of videos. Absolutely. Or just even putting like a video camera over a modeled lesson or whatever and not being able to be scared to do it. It helps parents a lot, and it gives them that access. And even to the point where if parents watch it, or at least they can at least be that accountable piece for the students or their kids or the children living at their house, as far as like, hey, you know what? I need you to watch this.
Yeah.
Just because we would communicate, even through applications like Class Dojo and whatnot, but giving them that access to see and do that. So I want to thank you so much for being a guest on our show today. And I understand you have a Makerspace Revolution and program coming to play at your site. How's that going so far?
It's going great. I think one of the things that we really want to continue to develop is teachers feeling comfortable in the space. Mm-hmm. It's tough. It's tough from going from a very structured classroom to kind of a more open kind of format and kids being able to like play and hang out. And, when you don't know how to use specific devices in there, it's kind of tricky to figure out like, well, how does this connect with the curriculum that I'm trying to teach, and how do I make it worthwhile and learning and not simply play, because I have a lot of things I need to teach and I don't have time to give my kids to just play. So I think in continuing professional development, we can ensure that teachers feel comfortable taking their kids in, recognizing that it's not simply play, but they're actually, very much using the mathematical practices, they're using language skills, that they're using all of these things in order to be able to work collaboratively in a makerspace. So we're still working on that.
Totally.
But it's a whole nother language, it's a whole nother language, it's a whole nother kind of way to think about education. And so
absolutely. And that's one thing I definitely want to focus on another episode, especially the blueprints, because I remember talking to you about blueprints and how to make these kind of centers accessible to our students. And then, of course, there's so many topics we can dive into of how to approach it. So maybe we can even share our story later on of how we created actually a makerspace at our former site. So that'd be something to collaborate with. But ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you guys for tuning in today. Please feel free to send an email to CB Garcia, for C as in Chris, B as in Brian, and then Garcia at sandiego.edu with questions or topics of discussion. Also, be sure to follow us on social media, at Twitter. The link will be posted as well on the link to this podcast. So we thank you guys for tuning in. Tune in to our next episode in March, and we'll be seeing you guys also at Q Conference happening later on this month in March. So thank you guys for tuning in, and we will talk to you and see you guys soon.